Hello and welcome to Minerva. Today we are doing some sewing tips on how to finish your seams. There are lots of different ways to finish your seams. You might start off one way when you're beginning and start to develop into some other ways of finish them off, but really it's just to stop the raw edge of the fabric from fraying. The simplest way to finish your seam edge, if you're new to sewing and you're sewing out of a shoebox or you don't have much space, is to use pinking shears. So pinking shears have a zigzag edge here, which cuts into the weave of the fabric, meaning it doesn't fray. It's really good as an interim way of stopping your fabric fraying as well. So if you're using a crepe or a georgette that's fraying as you're cutting it, you can cut out with pinking shears and then use one of the other seam finishes that I'm going to show you to make sure that it doesn't fray any further. They're a little bit harder going on your forearm and wrist, but as long as you take long strokes with pinking shears, you'll get that edge that you need to stop it fraying. Once you've washed the clothes, it will still stay pinked, and that's the simplest way to finish your seam edges. This way is really great and neat. It is to fold over your seam allowances and then just use a straight stitch. If your fabric is a little bit delicate, a zigzag can sometimes chew it up a little bit. So this way just means that you can just turn the edge under and sew it. It also works on pinking sheared fabric if your fabric is particularly liable to fraying, and you do that on both sides of the seam. And that's the seam finished. It's nice, that it's really neat. Done that on the shoulder seams, but it's also good on side seams, and that's great if your zigzag is a little bit temperamental on your machine, as long as you've got the 1.5 seam allowance to turn it under. The other slightly cheeky thing you can do to finish your seams is at the cutting stage is to use your selvedge. So I had to cut this skirt piece, and I was going to have a seam down the back. So to save me having to finish my seams at all, I put my pattern piece right to the edge of the fabric, and I've got the selvedge as my finished edge. So that's a way. It doesn't always work, but sometimes if you're a bit clever when you're cutting out, and if the idea of finishing your seams is to stop them fraying, then using the selvedge really does work. If you've got a basic machine, you'll have a zigzag stitch, so you can zigzag the edges. And that's a good method because you can do that before you sew the seam. So if you've got a fabric that's already fraying, even when you've just cut it, you can hurry up and zigzag all of the edges before you start manipulating any of the seams. Whereas the straight stitch one, where I just folded over, I would need to have my seam allowance fully intact and ready to measure for the seam. Don't go too close to the edge with this, or you'll pull the edge of your fabric in. I've done it close somewhere to show you. It'll chew it up a little bit if you go too close to the edge. So make sure you're not too close to the edge. And then when you make a seam and you join two pieces together, you can press them out and have that zigzag edge. It's absolutely fine. It's a really good way of just stopping the fabric from fraying. Another way you could finish your seams is with a Hong Kong seam finish, edge finish, and that's with a piece of bias binding over the edge of your raw edge. Now it does take a little bit longer. It is super neat. If it's on the inside of a top, I probably wouldn't bother, but if I was making something with a high-low hem where you would be able to see inside the garment, then I might use a Hong Kong seam so that it was really neat. It's really good if you're doing a circle skirt, something with a lower hem at the back. It works quite well in a throw-on cardigan style, where you have your seams exposed on the inside. Say if you're using boiled wool or a textured knit that's not aligned coatigan or cardigan or jacket. So let me show you how to do it. You put your bias binding right side to the wrong side, and you take a small 5mm seam allowance and sew the bias binding onto the edge of your fabric with the raw edges even. Next, you press the bias binding away from the wrong side so that you have all of your raw edges facing towards the binding. I've got a very flimsy viscose here, so I won't need to trim the seam out too much. Got a little bit of a bulge just there. And then you fold the binding in half, so not completely, in half, and it will give you a really small piece of binding that's coming over the edge of that raw edge. So there's the raw edge. You bring the binding over the top, and then you can edge stitch it. So you're going to have to get pretty close to the edge of that binding. It's quite a small space to work on, but go slow. And from this side, the side that you can see, the right side, just edge stitch as close to the edge of that binding as you can get. And this is the seam finish that you will get. It's absolutely exquisite. You can still measure your 1.5 seam allowance from the outside of the binding to the seam line, because we didn't change the width of that seam allowance at all. So that is because we matched them up raw edges. Then we've still got a 1.5 seam allowance. It's absolutely beautiful. If you're lucky enough to have an overlocker, or indeed space for an overlocker, then you can use that to finish your raw edges. You can use it on a single layer. And you will need to make sure that you've got a correct tension for that, depending on your fabric, so it's not bunching any of your fabric up or flaring it out into a ripple shape. That's really good on a hem or on your seam finishes. Sometimes I cut out my whole pattern piece, and then I overlock around everything before I even start sewing. You just have to be careful if you're using an overlocker. If you've marked notches, you might lose those within the seam edge. So that's why I use a little snip, because you can still see a snip through the overlock. If you put a notch on, your blade will just cut those off. So if you put little notches on for marking, you'll lose them, and then you won't have the markings that you need to start your project. If you've got a fine fabric like I've got here, you can use your overlocker to put the two seams together. You will need to make sure that you press your seam then to one side or the other, so it depends if it's suitable. If you need to split the seam, you'll need to do one layer of overlocking and then make the seam, or you can just overlock the two seams together. You'll get that type of finish if you used your overlocker to actually sew as well. And then when you press from the right side, you'll have to press your seam allowance to one side or the other, so just make sure it doesn't affect the look of your seam on the outside. So that's overlocking your raw edges. This is the Wilder gown, and I'm making it as a blouse, so it's a very loose fit with lots of gathers in it, so I can use the double edge overlock because I'm not expecting the seams to be on show or pressed out flat and actually seen on the garment. That will be within all the ripples around the ruffled neck, which is why I've chosen that technique for this particular garment. It's always good to have a few different techniques up your sleeve for finishing seams and raw edges of fabric, because as you choose different fabrics, you might need to choose a different technique. If you have any questions, please leave those below and we'll try our best to answer them. Join us again soon. Bye bye.